Something a little bit different from me today to the sort of paper that I usually give. I'd like to reflect a little bit on my kind of own positionality and my own relationship with alcohol as an alcohol researcher. So in terms of what I like to talk about today, I am going to start a little bit academic. So I'm going to think about, you know, what do we mean by positionality? What does it mean? What might it look like? And how have we seen it being used in kind of two different areas of research that I'm interested in? So kind of feminist research and alcohol research. Then the main body of the paper, really, I'm going to be drawing on examples from my own experiences. So thinking about particular moments or topics or encounters that have prompted, either at the time or in hindsight, some kind of reflection on my own positionality and my own relationship with alcohol. So the first project I'll be talking about is my PhD research in 2012-2013, when I looked at the girls' night outs. Then a more recent project exploring women's sobriety stories, so how recently sober women talk about sobriety, and then more recently a project around people's drinking during lockdown. So it spans about 10 years, which is quite an illustrious long drinking career from me, and you know, some interesting reflections on how my own relationship with alcohol has changed. And then finally I'll just close with a couple of reflections. I just wanted to start by thinking a bit about positionality. And to me, positionality is about thinking about where and how we are situated within our own research. And I really like this quote from Leatherby. She says, it's better to acknowledge our involvement rather than pretend to objectivity. So it's better to just be honest and upfront that we as researchers have a kind of relationship with what we're studying rather than pretend we can be objective. And for me, this really rings true. You know, researching alcohol and sobriety is so bound up with my own drinking and non-drinking practices. And also, I think, with my identity, with my sense of who I am. So just to give you an example, this is kind of where my drinking was at when I started my PhD about the girls' night out. And here I am at Rebellion Punk Festival in Blackpool, and I am embodying at least what I consider to be, you know, how one drinks and how one performs identity at a punk festival. So I'm street drinking here along with my friends, and I'm drinking a bottle of Buckfast or Bucky, which is a kind of fortified wine, which becomes the kind of representative drink at Rebellion Fest in Blackpool. So really for me to say that, you know, I'm removed from drinking cultures and I have no, you know, I'm not part of the world that I study would have been a false pretense to objectivity. But let's think a little bit about how feminists have talked about positionality. Feminists are pretty good at thinking about positionality. And I just wanted to follow on from that quote on the previous slide by saying, you know, one important aspect of a feminist methodology is rejecting the idea that there's this objective and stable social reality or single truth out there, and rejecting the idea of the neutral observer. So as Acker et al. Say, you know, the impossibility of eliminating all objectification exists in all social research. The problem cannot be solved by creating the illusion that no relationship exists between the researcher and her research object. So here, I think this idea of the neutral observer is important. So we are all situated within drinking cultures as researchers. You know, can we ever be neutral observers? We all have some kind of relationship with alcohol, whether we drink or don't drink. So in response to this then, feminist research calls for this reflexivity, this awareness and recognition of our presence within our work. And this includes the values and the biases that we bring, shaped by our own beliefs and characteristics, and also wider aspects of our identity. So gender, class, age, for example, how do these come into our research? So reflexivity makes us question and think about our involvement at all stages of the process, recognizing that no task, even something like interview transcription, can be unbiased and neutral or value-free. Finally, and I'm not going to have too much time to talk about this today, but I think it's an interesting one we could think about in discussion. Feminist methodologies also call for an awareness of power dynamics. So, you know, from our very capacity to select the topics that we research, right through to the way that we disseminate and share data, researchers, we could argue, have a particular power dynamic or power relationship with their participants. So I think it would be fair to say that positionality is not always acknowledged in alcohol research. Sometimes I find myself reading papers about alcohol and alcohol research. I'm actually reading one at the moment where I have no sense of the researcher's position, the researcher's identity, or the researcher's own aspects, own relationship with alcohol. Sorry, not that there has to be, you know, these huge heartfelt disclosures, but I think it's important to have a sense of where we are situated within these cultures. I just wanted to draw on a couple of exceptions that I thought were quite interesting. I'm sure there's more. One is Stepney's work, her doctoral work with young women, where she did interviews and ethnographic research with young women on nights out. And she talks here about having to engage in what she calls active impression management. So in listening to the stories of young women on nights out brought out a range of emotions, she says, shock, empathy, surprise, and so on. She talks about what she calls an ethical minefield. So if she was going to be judgmental and you know, suggest that drinking excessively was bad, many of her participants might not have opened up to her. But if she was non-judgmental and kind of colluded, it might look like she was endorsing stories of really harmful and high-risk drinking. So she talks about it as a kind of ethical roller coaster. And she goes on to say that her participants often asked her a lot of questions about her drinking because they recognize perhaps that judgments and moral discourses around women's drinking are rife. So they were trying to kind of maybe get validation or response from her as well. The second example that I wanted to draw on, I think Tom might be here with us today actually, is Fernell Reed's work on stag do's with men in Eastern Europe. So Tom reflects on the basic question to drink or not to drink in his research and argues that alcohol plays such a central role in the behaviour of stag do's that he had to participate in some consumption and share beers to be included and be part of the group. So he argues that at least some level of drinking was expected as a precondition of entry. He goes on to talk as well about embodied experiences in the field and sensory experiences. And of course, what strikes me from both of these examples as well is the significance of aspects of identity such as gender, but also class, sexuality and race, for example. So gender in terms of Stepney's access to being able to talk to young women about their experiences, and also in terms of Tom's access to the kind of homosocial space of the stag do. So what I wanted to do for the rest of the paper really is draw on my own experiences, as I said, from these 3 distinct projects that I've undertaken over the last 10 years. So the first project to talk about is my Girls' Night Out research. So interviewing young women in Newcastle about their drinking practices on nights out with female friends. And quite quickly, it became apparent that points around, as I say here in the slide, getting pissed and being sick were very commonly raised. So participants talked about binge drinking, memory loss. One of them had a weekly whitey night, which is drinking to the point of being sick. They also talked about blacking out and other harmful behaviours. So 2020, I just forgot what year it was then. 2021, Emily decided to look back and think, okay, how did I reflect on this at the time? So I looked at what I'd written in my PhD thesis. And what I find really interesting is that I actually tried to separate out this idea of the researcher from the personal. So I said, you know, on the one hand, I was present as a professional researcher representing the university. And whilst I in no way wanted to appear judgmental, I faced an ethical dilemma in that I did not want to be seen to be endorsing particular practices. So quite similar to Stepney's argument in the previous slide. I go on to say, on the other hand, I was present as a young woman who engages enthusiastically in the nighttime economy in Newcastle, a fact which undoubtedly contributed to my decision to carry out research on this topic in the first place. In a sense, my professional and personal identity were both implicated in the research process in different ways. So as I said, what I find interesting here is that in my kind of early work, I think I really tried to pull apart this idea of the professional researcher and the personal girl who really liked to go out and party quite hard in Newcastle. So there was this kind of tension here, I think. I go on to say in the PhD that the way that I managed some of these stories about high-risk drinking was by remaining fairly neutral. I mean, I wonder in hindsight what fairly neutral looks like. And I say that I was honest when participants asked me if I liked to go out and have a few drinks, which helped me to build rapport. So thinking about this topic of rapport kind of leads me nicely onto this second piece of research that I've undertaken really. So rapport was really central to a piece of research that I undertook in 2018-2019 when I was speaking to women who identified as former heavy drinkers in early sobriety. Now, what is interesting about this piece of research, obviously when I was doing the Girls' Night Out work in 2012, 2013, I was a heavy drinker. myself. But when I started this project in 2018, 2019, I had stopped drinking about a year prior to starting the research. So I was speaking to women in the first 6 to 12 months of sobriety as someone who was myself about 12 months sober. So it definitely had a completely different dynamic and a different way of talking about and thinking about alcohol. So again, I looked back and I thought, how did I reflect on this at the time? And I pulled out something from a journal article where I did a bit of reflection on my positionality. And what's interesting is that I recruited the women that I spoke to through a Facebook group called Women Who Don't Drink. I was a user of the Facebook group at the time, so I was posting things about my own milestones, my own successes. These posts were fairly innocuous in many ways. I didn't go into a lot of personal detail, but I already had an established presence on the Facebook group through which I was recruiting. So let's have a look at how I reflected on this at the time. So I say, perhaps quite obviously, I'd been sober around a year when conducting the interviews, allowing me to empathise with participants, build rapport, and assure them the interview was a non-judgmental space. Furthermore, my position as a member of the Facebook group likely helped participants to feel comfortable contacting me. However, even seeing some of my fairly innocuous posts in the group about my own sobriety milestones may have made participants feel a degree of pressure to show me a certain version of their own successful self in sobriety. And I think this was definitely apparent. So there was real evidence in the interviews of the women engaging in impression management. And what I want to make really clear here was when I was talking to these women about stopping drinking, I'm not saying that the benefits of sobriety were not real for these women. Absolutely. They, were waxing lyrical about stopping drinking. And I'm not saying that these benefits were not real. What I'm saying is they may have been constructing a particular narrative of successful sobriety, both within and beyond the interview, particularly because they knew they were speaking to a sober confidant. They knew they were speaking to someone who had this was able to relate in these particular ways. So participants could see what I'd posted in the Facebook group and the way that I'd positioned and constructed my own sobriety. What they couldn't see was my own personal social media accounts. And I've put a couple of examples from these on the side of the slide here. So I think what's really interesting is it's all well and good for me to think about how my participants were doing impression management. But then I started thinking about my own impression management through sobriety and how that's quite interesting as well. So I've included a couple of examples from my Instagram at 10 months of sobriety and 12 months of sobriety, a time period covered by the project. So you probably can't read all the text, which is probably for the best because it's a bit cringe on these two posts. But the first one here is the obligatory, my life is so much better kind of post with a sort of candid before and after shot to talk about, how much better I feel with the picture on the right in terms of my newfound sobriety. I go on to talk a little bit about the weight loss as an unexpected benefit, and also finish by saying, I just feel really fucking kick-ass, that is all. The post below is a celebratory post to mark 1 year of not drinking. And I think the text that I've used here upon reflection is quite interesting as well. So there's a kind of self-deprecating bit where I say, I never would have believed I could rock a whole year sober. So this positions me as someone who's still fun, right? I'm not square, I'm not boring. If anything, I'm the last person you might expect to stop drinking. I also make a point, as I've just said there, of telling you how much I'm rocking being sober. And I go on to say, I'm having a cheeky night out in Glasgow. Again, positioning myself as someone who is still fun despite my sobriety. And I wonder if there was a bit of anxiety there about wanting to come across as this fun person. I don't know what the antlers filter was all about. Wish I could ask my past self. But these kinds of performances, these quite very public displays of sobriety, I think mirrored some of the ways in which my participants talked about their own sober identities. There was lots of emphasis on celebratory vibes. There was focus on the idea of progress, the idea of a journey, and the use of milestones to help them to tell me the story of their sobriety. I also found that participants sought reassurance and validation of their experiences from me, or were keen to establish commonalities between their experiences and mine, and also wanted to ask me questions about my experiences. So I'm going to talk a little bit in the next slide about an example of how I managed, or perhaps didn't manage, that. So here we have an exchange with Karen. Karen flips the script here. It's quite late into the interview. We've been talking for over an hour, and she flips the script to ask me about my drinking. So she says, how many days have you done alcohol-free, or are you not counting? And I go on to figure it out and say about 11 months now. She says, what was your worst time? When did you find it most difficult? And I say, what, in sobriety? Yes. And then I say, do you know what? I kind of haven't, which has been really nice. I'm not a big fan of Christmas anyway, and I found Christmas difficult for other reasons because my mum is not very well. That wasn't triggering. It was just a bit of a crappy time of year. Birthday, fine. So what this I think is quite an interesting exchange. So you can see I quite quickly responded to Karen and did disclose some personal stuff. I quickly calculated the amount of time hadn't been drinking, and I ended up sharing some quite personal information about my mum not being very well. And this isn't really something I would normally volunteer, but as I said, we were about an hour into a really rich and in-depth interview, and Karen had been really open, so maybe I felt that I should kind of reciprocate and give something back to her. However, what I find really interesting about this extract upon reflection is that actually I kind of deflect Karen's question about my worst time, about my most difficult time. Instead, I fall back on these tropes, on these ideas of what could be potentially difficult moments. So Christmas and birthdays usually recognized as difficult periods in early sobriety. But I very quickly say, you know, these experiences have been fine in the case of my birthday, or difficult for other reasons in terms of Christmas. So really what this looks like to me is a sort of half disclosure. It's like I wanted to give something back to Karen, and I actually gave her something about something quite personal that was going on with my family at the time, but I actually didn't talk very much here about my non-drinking. You know, she downright asked me about the most difficult or the worst time I'd experienced since I'd stopped, and I kind of deflect the question and say, do you know what, I kind of really haven't had a difficult time, which has been nice. So the final project that I wanted to reflect on is a little bit different, because my own drinking practices have now come out of alignment with those of my participants. So girls' night out, they're drinking, I'm drinking, everyone's drinking. Sobriety stories, again, speaking to women in a similar position to me who stopped drinking. For the Drinking in Lockdown project, I'm speaking to drinkers about how their drinking practices have changed during the pandemic, as someone who is now a good few years sober. And I didn't really have much of a plan. I didn't really think about how I was going to handle it if participants flipped the script and asked me about my non-drinking. And what you can see here is two moments where I could have been exposed in interviews or focus groups. So my status as a non-drinker could have been revealed. So Mel asks me, how have you experienced it? Have you drunk more during lockdown? And I say, I stopped drinking a couple of years ago, actually. And I go on to say I was always a social drinker, didn't really drink at home. So I'd have been interested to see what happened to my drinking during lockdown. In the second example, you can see that perhaps it was easier to just laugh it off. So Nigel asks me if I'm drinking a gin and tonic during the focus group. I laugh and take a drink of my water and kind of move the conversation on after that. So my reactions are quite different in these two examples. Perhaps it's because in the first one I was being directly questioned and asked if I drank more, whereas in the second example, it was easier to laugh it off, and I kind of avoided disclosure, as we often call it, of my non-drinking status. So what I think is interesting here is the moment when being a non-drinker is revealed or exposed represents a kind of rupture, a sort of moment of discomfort, something that disrupts the flow of social interaction, both in the interviews and focus groups as here, but also much more widely in social situations. So obviously as a non-drinker, this is not my first rodeo. I'm really used to those moments in social settings, usually in a pub, so you're already in a drinking session, drinking context, where the fact that I don't drink comes to light and has to be managed or handled in some kind of way. And usually it has to be managed, or usually we often, or maybe I manage it in a way to try and put drinkers at ease. So I thought it was just really interesting to note here that a practice that I'm used to navigating in real life, if you like, was kind of mirrored onto the research encounter. Oh. And really quickly, just to end with a couple of reflections to try and tie it all together, really. So I think reflexivity in all stages of the research and writing is essential. We need to position ourselves. We need to include some degree of reflection on our own relationships with alcohol. You know, I would never have started that PhD on the girls' night out, and I wouldn't be sat here today, and I wouldn't be an alcohol researcher if I hadn't been the girl who also necked a bottle of Bucky at Rebellion. So my relationship with alcohol and my relationship with sobriety are so intertwined with my academic work. Secondly, impression management and this idea of edited stories or displays of drinking and non-drinking are not limited to our participants. From my sort of staged drinking photos at Blackpool through to my candid Instagram posts about my sobriety, as a researcher, I am also performing drinking or non-drinking on a daily basis. And then finally, for those of us who are non-drinkers, disclosing our non-drinking status in a research encounter mirrors those wider processes where we are continually disclosing or redisclosing our sober status in social settings. Brilliant. Thank you so much, everyone. I look forward to just taking any questions after the next paper.
So, yeah, I'm really pleased to introduce the next session. And we've got two really great speakers. So I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, who's Diane Gosler, who's going to speak about her, as she's already mentioned, her own experience of heavy drinking, treatment and recovery. Diane is a qualified sociologist with further qualifications in postgraduate French and librarianship. Her early career was in an academic library, followed by both teaching and translating French. After several years working in research and public relations for 3 leading London architectural practices, Diane set up her own public relations practice, providing PR services to a number of clients. Diane's business and career were abruptly ended by her becoming alcohol dependent. However, over time and with a great deal of NHS treatment and support, she detoxed and entered recovery. Since then, she has been deeply involved at the Royal College of Psychiatrists in a number of committees and groups, as well as writing articles and papers, speaking publicly and making 3 podcasts. So Back from the Brink, Recovery Road and Surviving Stigma. These describe what it is like to be addicted, how she embarked on recovery, the role of medical professionals and the importance of aftercare. She is a member of the Royal College of Psychiatrists Policy and Public Affairs Committee, and also the Centre for Advanced Learning and Conferences, and has for the last 3 years presented at the Royal College of Psychiatrists International Congress. She also talks regularly from a patient's perspective to 1st and 4th year medical students when they are studying addictions at St George's Medical School in London. That's great. Well, thanks very much, Diane. Over to you.
Imagine waking in the early hours of every morning bathed in sweat. Imagine stumbling downstairs at that inhospitable hour to drink from one of your carefully hidden bottles until hopefully the shaking calms down. Then staggering back to bed, hoping sleep will now come. Imagine shaking so much that you can't even hold your glass steady enough to drink from it. Imagine sleeping in the street because you can't find your way home. Imagine forgetting about your job, your family, your friends, and thinking only about your next drink and nothing else. Well, that's what it's like being an alcoholic. That's what it was like for me for many years. And so with a great deal of hope, excuse me, I managed to confront this friendly foe and eventually entered recovery. Excuse me a second. It's really difficult dealing with alcohol dependence and living in a society where alcohol is so prevalent and assumes so much importance. You're surrounded by references to alcohol at every turn. It plays a large role in socializing with friends and in communities, for celebrating important events and for commiserating and comforting when things go wrong. It eases difficult situations, gives courage when needed, and can facilitate business discussions. It also assumes that if you want to be a fun, interesting person, then you have to drink. But alcohol has a darker side, which I found out to my cost. How is it that something that can be so positive can quickly turn into a monster? What turns a person from 1 minute enjoying a drink and the next minute not being able to survive without it? I would love to be able to drink alcohol, but because of what has happened to me, due to my abuse of this substance, I can't, ever. And if you can't drink alcohol, Particularly on social occasions, you feel like an outsider. Someone who was trying to overcome a drugs problem once said to me that it must be harder trying to come off alcohol than drugs, although I do know alcohol is a drug, as it would be like having a dealer on every corner. I don't know why I became an alcoholic. My drinking started innocuously enough. I drank for social reasons and for business entertaining with alcohol's help. As time and my career moved on, alcohol steadily increased in frequency and importance and began to take its grip. Suddenly, my drinking was getting way out of control. I couldn't remember what I'd been doing the day before. My hands were beginning to shake uncontrollably, and I couldn't sleep very easily because I was so uncomfortable. Eventually, I plucked up courage to tell my GP, finally admitting to her that maybe I was drinking too much. She referred me to an alcohol treatment centre. There, they asked me what I wanted to achieve, and I replied, control drinking. The notion of stopping drinking totally was abhorrent to me. After being interviewed and assessed, the lead clinician, a psychiatrist, said that he thought I wouldn't be able to control my drinking because of the amount I consumed daily and the length of time I'd been drinking at that level. But what did he know? I insisted it had to be controlled drinking, and abstinence was not a problem. And sorry, not an option, it was a problem. The very idea filled me with horror. Alcohol was by now my friend and support, so it was agreed. Control drinking was the aim. The treatment I received was not medication, but counselling, where you were made to look at yourself, keep a diary of how much and when you drank, say what your mood was at the time, and talk any problems through with your key worker. After a time, and of my own choice, I left the treatment centre, convinced I would now be able to control my drinking. I'd got my drinking down to what I thought was a very reasonable amount, and said I was ready to leave. To my great surprise, I was told I wasn't ready and should stay. I said, no, I wouldn't stay, but then I was very grateful for all their help. And then I discharged myself. Sadly, I failed miserably. Yes, I did manage to control my drinking for about 3 months, and then I was back to my old alcohol abusing ways. Only this time it became more excessive. The next several alcohol-fueled years and the awful things that happened to me were thankfully a blur. It's only recently that my husband has told me what these years did to him and what he had to cope with. I now know that he covered up for me, laughed off my awful and embarrassing behaviour with friends and business associates, picked me up when I fell over and cleaned me up. Apparently, it was a welcome respite when I passed out. I didn't realise at the time that we more or less stopped socialising. This was because I was an embarrassment to all. People didn't want to put up with that. In any event, I wasn't interested in anything or anyone except fellow drinkers and how much I could drink. The effect on colleagues was immense. Because of the fallout, I was fired. I wasn't capable of working anyway, so that's where it stayed. Eventually, I reached the end of the road. It took 5 long, alcohol-soaked years after leaving the treatment centre to summon the strength to return to my GP and ask her to refer me back again. This time, I knew that I had to ask the staff to help me to become abstinent. So, after the required, very lengthy preparation, I detoxed. This was done with medication and regular checking every day by the medical team. The detox was horribly distressing and very difficult to go through. It included horrible aspects such as difficulty balancing, a lot of nausea, and frightening hallucinations, which I shall never forget. It's certainly an incentive to keep sober, if nothing else, as I wouldn't want to go through that again. Even now, it is difficult to remain abstinent, but I have no choice. I'd like now to mention the psychiatrist who, remember, was the lead clinician, and what he did for me, and why it was so important. To be honest, I can't remember all that much about my initial sessions with him, such as the effect of alcoholism, but I do recall that I was, possibly unwillingly, impressed. He spoke to me, but he didn't talk down to me. He spoke to me as if I was an intelligent person who could understand what he was saying. And he listened. I can't tell you how important that was and what an impact it had. Of course, as the sessions progressed, the whole experience wasn't easy, and we were not always in agreement, but I was never forced into doing anything I didn't want to do. Instead, I was given information and guided into making my own decisions. Although, come to think of it, my psychiatrist wasn't always totally patient with me, but then I could at times be extremely stubborn and annoying. You see, Alcoholics can be very manipulative, and I was no exception. However, I realized that my dubious arguments, my coaxing and pleading, weren't having the desired effect. I'm sure I wasn't an easy patient, being very determined to get my own way and my point of view across, whatever it took. And I was actually pleased that he saw through me. I admired him for it. I was treated with kindness and respect too, but it wasn't the easy ride as I thought it was going to be, when all I had to do was convince this person that I knew best. I'd mentioned previously that against his strong advice, I'd been allowed to go for control drinking, which had failed. When at the end of the road, I now saw the same psychiatrist 5 years later, he helped me detox without any hint of, I told you so. At times, he was very tough with me. Presumably, he thought I could take it, which I could. The sticking point between us was that while I realized that I had to do something about my drinking, which was by now totally out of control, causing huge dramas, misery, and numerous accidents, I wanted to be given the magic pill, which would control my drinking, and then all would be fine. He, of course, told me that this pill didn't exist. I vividly remember the psychiatrist saying that I'd lots to offer, and why was I wasting what I had? I needed to hear that, as being at rock bottom, my self-image was absolutely zero. Although there were other wonderful people in the team who helped me enormously, I have to say, at the end of the day, throughout this horribly difficult time, that my psychiatrist was the central pivot, the stability, often the reason I kept going. I was fortunate to see the psychiatrist I did. I shall never forget him, nor what he did for me. I gave him my trust, and he didn't let me down. Now, from a personal perspective, I want to look at some of the effects of alcoholism. Remember, when you're an alcoholic, the need for alcohol simply overrides everything, and nothing else is remotely important. Personal interaction and social mores really don't matter. Let me tell you about a few things that happened to me when I was drinking heavily. Everyone knows about liver damage, but what about the other things that are not so well known? There's the shaking. At some point in the progression of the disease, you get the shakes, and it's both intense and debilitating. I can remember when the shaking got so bad that I could no longer hold my glass without spilling its contents everywhere. And my husband used to hold my glass for me so that I could drink out of it. Social occasions, people would stare at me, but I didn't care. I needed to drink alcohol, whatever that took. And what about the damage you do to yourself through loss of motor control and lack of spatial awareness? I can't tell you how many times I've fallen downstairs, cut or bruised my body somewhere, bumped into objects, or generally damaged yourself. There's no real awareness of danger, you see. Often you lie about the cause of an injury to your GP when asking her to mend the damage. And I wonder how often my GP was fooled. I've also sometimes ended up sleeping outside on the doorstep, outside in the street, as I couldn't function enough to turn my key in the lock to get inside. It's amazing I wasn't mugged or worse. And then there are the blackouts, the loss of consciousness when your body simply cannot function anymore. Unfortunately, this happened to me rather frequently and ranged in severity from passing out gently at the dinner table or restaurant to being carried off a plane in a comatose condition and waking up later in hospital. Now, I recoil at these things that happened, and I'm embarrassed when I think about them. I'm telling you about these incidents because I want you to understand what can happen when you're in the grip of an addiction that takes over your life and renders you powerless. But there is even more terrible damage that may occur, the damage that you can do to your nervous system and to your brain. I know, because both of these things have happened to me. It's the fact that whether addicted or not, as you drink more alcohol, your mind works less efficiently and the power of reasoning and understanding diminishes. You are just not as fully aware of what is going on around you. That effect is multiplied when you're addicted, and the only important thing is having more alcohol. The idea that you may not have access to alcohol is very frightening, so you probably don't want to put down your glass or bottle, as you only feel secure when holding them. But it's this loss of mental agility that's so serious and worrying, as you're probably not even aware that it's happening. When I look back now, I find it extremely distressing that I couldn't use my mind. Indeed, I didn't want to use it. One of the most gratifying aspects of being sober is that I can now enjoy using my mind again. However, I discovered that I've suffered some brain damage due to my alcohol abuse. After a brain scan, my neurologist confirmed this and said it was most probably due to alcohol. My mind is very precious to me, and the fact that I have brain damage due to my own alcohol abuse is personally devastating. As time goes on, and as your drinking increases, you start to gravitate towards those friends who drink a lot. A friend is someone with whom you have a bond, and that bond becomes alcohol. That can result in neglecting those friends who don't have the same way of drinking. I'm very fortunate in that I've managed to keep most of my friends, even though I didn't see some of them for a very long time. That is partly because alcohol wasn't the main thing of their lives, so increasingly we had nothing in common, and then later, after I detoxed, I couldn't cope with the interaction. They could drink alcohol and I couldn't. That was too hard. In fact, amongst my friends, I'm the only one who doesn't drink. That's a hard one. You see, when you detox, you make a decision if your friends drink, and let's face it, most people do. Do you stay with them, knowing how hard it's going to be? Or do you say goodbye to them and put yourself in an ivory tower with people who have the same problem as yourself, hoping that these new, safer friendships will become established and in time flourish? I decided to stick with my old friendships. My very close friends know that I'm addicted to alcohol, and other friends don't. How do I achieve this? I achieve this by drinking non-alcoholic wine, which looks the same. The taste isn't too bad, but I have no choice. What it comes down to is that I definitely want to look part of the group and not stick out like a sore thumb. I admire those who can sit happily sipping mineral water while the rest enjoy their wine or beer, but I can't do that. I want to be seen as an integral fun person in the group and not a dampener on others, and I have a horror of appearing pious. These fears seem to be partly addressed by my looking the same, looking as if I'm drinking wine along with the rest of the group. It isn't perfect by any means, and I would love to give anything to drink, as I love alcohol, as I've said, but it's a good second best. You may think that's pathetic, but it works for me. The self-image of an addicted person takes a real battering. I lost all confidence and all sense of self-esteem. I knew that things were lousy, but couldn't do anything about it. And in any case, it didn't really matter. In fact, at some weird, masochistic level, you enjoy that things are unpleasant. You drink alcohol to get the effect, even when it tastes nasty. Maybe feeling at rock bottom and staying there, in a funny sort of way, is comfortable and an excuse not to do anything. You don't feel you have the ability or control to do so anyway. Or perhaps it's a form of self-punishment, as you don't feel you deserve anything better. An element that is linked to self-image is stigma, and this, unfortunately, is quite prevalent. Addicts, particularly women probably, tend to be somewhat stigmatized in society. I've experienced stigma. It's not nice. It's diminishing, it's destructive, and it can be very difficult to cope with. Addiction, this frightening disease, impacts in so many ways. It takes its toll. As I've said, I don't know why I became addicted. I had a great career, a busy business and social life, and good friends. I certainly wasn't lonely or bored. I suppose I use alcohol as a crutch, not against loneliness or boredom, but rather to support me through a stressful life where drink was the norm. Alcohol does make you feel better and more able to cope with whatever is difficult. Addiction creeps up on you, slowly and relentlessly, and suddenly it's too late. Alcohol is the master, and you're totally powerless. Well, I've managed to detox. I now speak regularly to students at St. George's Medical School in London when they're studying addictions and tell them what it's like being an addict and how I cope. I also answer any questions they have. They have a lot of questions, and being students, they ask quite a lot of questions, and sometimes not always easy. The feedback on these medical student sessions is always very good. Apparently, they really enjoy talking to a real patient. So far, I've managed to stay sober, touch wood. It's a battle most days, and I assure you I don't take it for granted. My life has changed enormously. I know I'm less tolerant, maybe because I have an internal battle a lot of the time. I want to drink and feel its effects, to have my wine poured out of the same bottle as everyone else, but I can't. I must fill my own glass separately. I was warned, by the way, during the treatment that if I carried on, I would be dead in 6 months. I also have to continually check whether there's any alcohol in the food I eat. Do you have any idea how much food contains alcohol? A lot. I'm less relaxed too, because I can never use alcohol to take the edge off a situation. I suppose I use alcohol in part to get rid of my inner demons, to cover up my own internal issues. You can see that being abstinent because of alcohol dependence is really tough. But I have to be, because my drinking went way beyond the point of no return. I've said to politicians many times, both in my personal capacity and with the Royal College of Psychiatrists, how very important treatment is for alcohol misuse, and that any intervention should be introduced as early as possible. Also, the more tools that are made available in the treatment of this disease, the better. It's no fun having to be abstinent. So if people can be helped before they get to the stage I do, then that can only be a good thing. I really don't want others to go through what I've suffered, and still do. I'd like to quote from the book Beautiful Boy, which is the father's account of his son, Nick, becoming an addict. He says later on in his book, when Nick was actually sober for a time, I wanted this now to be Nick's post-addiction phase of our lives. But no, it is still so easy to forget that addiction is not curable. It's a lifelong disease that can go into remission, that is manageable if the one who is stricken does the hard work, but it is incurable. I miss drinking alcohol very much, and to be quite honest, things aren't the same. I'm not the same. Mind you, it's definitely worth it. Being able to think, understand, analyse, and communicate again is great. Let's hope it lasts. I'll do the best I can. I try every day. Thank you for listening, and I'm very happy to answer questions after this next presentation.
Thank you very much, Diane. Thank you for being so candid, and that was extremely powerful, so thank you. Okay, yeah, we're going to answer questions afterwards. So I'm just going to move on to James's presentation, and I can see James there. Hi, James. Okay, so I'll introduce James now. Dr. James Morris is a research fellow at London South Bank University with a particular interest in alcohol problems, stigma, framing, and problem recognition. He is also working for Public Health England on new clinical guidelines for alcohol treatment. James has close to 20 years experience in the alcohol field and has lived experience of problem drinking. James hosts the Alcohol Problem podcast, which aims to explore the nature of problem drinking through a range of academic and lived experience perspectives. He is editor of Alcohol Policy UK and chair of the New Directions in the Study of Alcohol group. Over to you, James. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm slightly out of my comfort zone today for several reasons. The first is that what I'm presenting is a paper I've written with a couple of colleagues, Professor Tony Moss and Dr. Sharon Cox. And this paper kind of comes from a lot of kind of discussion, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to present it and get views on it, because I think, you know, for me, despite having kind of mulled and discussed on it for probably several years now, and it being a very, you know, positioned piece within my own experiences and my kind of career in the alcohol field, I still really think it's a work in development. And it's, you know, it's a kind of commentary rather than kind of quantitative research, which is kind of my research field, really. And the other thing, you know, is really that this is a piece where I'm basically arguing that the position, the narratives of lived experience don't really reflect the broad experience of alcohol use disorders that exist across a wider population. So, you know, I'm really grateful for Diane and other people that have spoken in this forum and more broadly about their lived experiences. I really can't emphasize enough, this is not an attack on people who share their lived experience, particularly those who do so within kind of what I will propose are kind of two dominant narratives of alcohol lived experience. I think those are really valuable and really important. So the thesis is not to attack those existing narratives, but rather to try and say that we need to broaden the base of kind of lived experience narratives that are available for people who might have kind of different and particularly, I think, less severe alcohol use disorders. That's particularly what I'm going to come on to. And the other thing is, because I timed my paper last night, reading it out, it was a bit long. I'm kind of starting from, well, I'm omitting the introduction, and the introduction essentially sets out why we think lived experience is so important and reiterates what I was trying to say about this not being an attack on the existing, what we see as the existing dominant narratives, but rather that we feel that there maybe needs to be some reflection on how we can maybe foster some other lived experience narratives. So I've got some slides as well, which will just include a couple of quotes. So the first quote is just this one, which comes from a qualitative study of older adults. My brother and I both enjoy a drink, both enjoy a social drink. My brother, even though he's a bit older than me, still has lads' night out, where he has a damn good skinful, comes home after putting the world to rights and feels great. That can't be bad. So I'm not going to comment on that. I'm just going to start by kind of jumping into this paper. So in this paper, we'll argue that two main narratives currently dominate lived experiences of problem alcohol use, particularly important because people with non-dependent alcohol use disorders make up around a quarter of the adult population, which is about 10 times larger than the population of people that Public Health England target for treatment interventions, i.e. people with kind of moderate to severe dependence. So essentially by alcohol use disorders, I mean people who drink above the guidelines, which will probably become more apparent. So we argue that there's two main current dominant lived experience narratives, which I'll talk about, and that they don't necessarily represent the full range of lived experiences of people who may experience alcohol-related problems. And that whilst the existing narratives definitely do resonate with some people, this kind of focus, which both of which are focused on abstinence, doesn't resonate with many drinkers for whom moderation or reductions in consumption might be a more suitable way of reducing personal risk and harm. So again, I'm not saying that that abstinence isn't a suitable goal, and certainly I believe abstinence is a very important, if not, the best treatment goal for treatment populations, but I'm saying there's a wider population of people who don't necessarily need abstinence. So in the absence of salient and meaningful narratives to represent this wider alcohol use disorder group, the promotion of low-risk drinking guidelines has been the main public health intervention. Yet this has failed to resonate. Instead, various alcohol use disorder groups state that they know their own limits and they draw on their own representations of who problem drinkers are. Similarly, the implementation of brief intervention programs has also largely failed as a public health strategy, in part due to the failure to shift perceptions of problematic alcohol use away from more severe alcoholism ideas. So I'll now present on the kind of two dominant lived experience narratives, which I think will resonate, including their origins and for the groups that they may be most meaningful for, and then attempt to draw some attention to what we might be some other narratives that might be kind of worth considering as well. This next quote I have, which I think will kind of be familiar. I've just got a quote here. I drink in moderation, like my daughter, she's alcoholic. She would sit there and drink a full 2 crates. I've seen her drink 2 bottles of vodka. She's terrible, I couldn't do that. And I think what's interesting about this quote is that it's from a participant who scored 10 out of 12 on the audit C. So that's certainly a very harmful level of alcohol consumption. I think it's a good example of what we commonly see as othering, where people point to more severe problem drinkers to kind of deflect from their own possible problematic drinking. And yeah, I think that's classically the alcoholic stereotype is often used for that kind of othering process. So the dominant narrative of lived experience in contemporary discourse is that of the recovering alcoholic. Foundations for this were set in the first half of the 20th century with examples of influential advocates such as Marty Mann, one of the first people to use her own lived experience of alcohol problems in an attempt to aid wider societal understandings of the harms of alcohol. She spoke openly about her past struggles, often on radio, and came to be regarded as an important figure in the advocacy of humane treatment for alcohol problems, or alcoholism as it was widely known. The value of her experience was a powerful force for recognition of alcohol problems and the story of affected women who remain disproportionately affected by the stigma surrounding alcohol. The concept of alcoholism itself is rooted in long history, increasingly popular since the development of Alcoholics Anonymous and the dispositional disease model of alcoholism through the 20th century. Whilst individual beliefs about alcoholism are undoubtedly diverse and often ambivalent or contradictory, certain tropes are widely endorsed amongst the public, driving stigma towards those perceived as problem drinking. For example, a representative survey in Great Britain in 2006, most people believed that people with alcoholism were a danger to others, unpredictable, and only had themselves to blame. Media representations still commonly label people with alcohol problems as alcoholics, even when they haven't identified as such themselves. And this in turn reifies common stereotypes of denial and addicts being constructed of deficient or weak character. So the pervasiveness of stigma around alcohol problems has been identified as a significant reason for low levels of help seeking amongst dependent drinkers, globally estimated at just 1 in 6. Further, it has been proposed that problem drinking is particularly stigmatized because many drinkers actually seek to reinforce negative alcoholic stereotypes in order to other problem drinkers, as per the quote, in turn normalizing their own responsible drinking behaviors, responsible again in kind of air quotes. Othering therefore demonstrates separation and difference as key stages of the stigma process via which people with addiction are seen and often deliberately portrayed as a distinct outgroup. In turn, managing stigma and shame is a crucial component to recovery, as we've heard a bit of already today. And so owning, resolving, or managing a stigmatized entity is a particular part of the recovery process. Meanwhile, calls to reduce public stigma include the use of person-first language and sharing lived experience. Indeed, evidence shows that stigma can be reduced when people with lived experience share their stories, theorized in part through reducing the kind of perceived idea of separation in and out groups. However, common representations of alcohol problems, particularly via recovering alcoholic lived experience, invariably draw heavily on a set of meanings that invoke ideas of powerless and loss of control, whilst hitting rock bottom also represents a strong and generic narrative. The relaying of lived experience via recovering alcoholic narratives may therefore increase empathy and potentially alleviate blame for the assumed disease of addiction by highlighting it as still a human condition. However, such disease-orientated representations also appear to increase perceptions of social distance and desire for separation by reinforcing the other alcoholic outgroup. In turn, people who adopt or consider adopting an alcoholic identity evaluate its consequences for the self, including in terms of stigma and the commitment to lifelong abstinence. I think Diane really powerfully demonstrated that when she talked about her initial contact and kind of wanting moderation or controlled drinking as a goal. As such, many problem drinkers reject or fail to benefit from engaging with recovery narratives or associated practices. Thus, whilst visible lived experiences of recovery from alcoholism is an important narrative, it is not without its limitations, particularly in considering its suitability to non-dependent alcohol use disorder groups. And the second kind of more recent dominant narrative I'm going to propose, which you'll also be familiar with, lived experience as positive sobriety. So I've got a quote here from Lucy Rocker. I'm sure many of you know her. She gave me permission to use this quote. Open your mind and believe me when I say that, yes, you'll become a different person, but future you will be 1,000,000 times more interesting, more confident, more sociable, and less miserable once you've kicked the boots. We now turn to a second dominant, albeit more recent narrative about problematic alcohol use, which has been described as new or positive sobriety. This movement appears to reflect a consumer-led response to the need for alternatives to normative drinking practices. Within this movement, a number of companies and organisations have sought to harness or capitalise on the proliferation of those who are alcohol-free and proud in different ways. Alongside this, an exponentially growing market of low and no alcohol drinks has grown, and organisations have positioned themselves as key actors within this movement. Alcohol Change's flagship Drive January campaign, for instance, encourages non-dependent drinkers to sign up for an alcohol-free start to the year to help prompt the realisation of the benefits of temporary abstinence, which some participants choose to maintain. Another large key player has been Club Soda, which identifies as a mindful drinking movement and offers a number of free and paid resources for members. Club Soda have run a series of events, including mindful drinking festivals designed as alcohol-free spaces, and host regular discussion panels, including speakers with significant social media influence focused on new sobriety narratives. This newer form of an alcohol-free identity may partially reflect the aforementioned limitations of the alcoholism as recovery narrative. Indeed, many drinkers mistakenly perceive AA as the only available support for individuals with problematic relationships with alcohol. And this in turn appears to instigate the use of online spaces offering alternative abstinence-orientated identities, many of which of participants today are researching and contributed to references I'm using here. While some of these echo models of recovery via emphasis on peer support, for example, Soberistas, a defining aspect appears to be the focus on positive alcohol-free lifestyle identity, which represents an authentic and positive self. This is reflected in common narratives in which new or reclaimed sense of self is found when unburdened from the problems that alcohol has been causing. The rise of positive sobriety, though not causally related, appears to be associated with a significant but much debated decline in youth and younger adult drinking. Some have posited that the rejection of drinking reflects a way for younger generations to set their identities apart as sober rebels, a counterculture which is diametrically opposed to the generation before them. Of course, declines in youth drinking should be seen as a positive public health shift, but who takes part in these movements and whose voices are heard when telling these stories of the prospective benefits is important. So on to what we kind of maybe suggested more about in terms of broadening the library of lived experience. Just another quote from a recent article. I think the recommended drinking guidelines are a little bit unrealistic and unreasonable. They don't really know anything about us. I don't think I ever listened to them. They just generalize without understanding exactly what's going on. So current practices of lived experience, particularly via service user representation, while valuable, may inadvertently promulgate a false binary between those with and without experience. Indeed, the tight focus on the clinical end of addiction problems is arguably a convenient heuristic in which the motivation to other problem drinkers operates below conscious awareness. Representations of lived experience should therefore reflect a broader continuum of alcohol use and harms that fundamentally challenges the false binary between so-called problem drinkers as others and the associated assumptions such as abstinence being the only way to recover from an alcohol use disorder. As presented above, current narratives resisting pro-alcohol social norms or recovering from dependence are highly valuable, but largely only available as abstinence-orientated paradigms. Without questioning the value or freedom to choose abstinence, it's important to note its limitation in appealing to a larger population of at-risk or harmful drinkers who make up around a quarter of all adults in England. The majority of these drinkers like us are unlikely to wish to stop drinking altogether, and indeed the belief that abstinence is a necessity for resolving alcohol problems has been identified as a major barrier to help seeking in some literature. Rather, most at-risk drinkers, and especially those drinking harmfully, place a high value on a range of social and personal benefits to their alcohol use, whilst often downplaying their risk of present or future problems. As such, we argue that in addition to the existing narratives highlighted previously, a more diverse range of nuanced and alternative lived experience narratives are needed to allow a broader and considerable population of at-risk drinkers to more objectively evaluate their own alcohol use. Have I got a couple more minutes left, like 5 minutes or less? Yeah. One example of a valuable alternative narrative has been through Adrian Charles's through his public exploration about his alcohol use, notably through the BBC documentary Drinkers Like Me, which was widely applauded for its sober, fascinating and disarmingly honest look at social drinking. It opens with Charles stating, "My name's Adrian Charles and I'm not an alcoholic, at least I don't think I am." In many ways, the show's success may be attributed to the way in which it tactfully disentangles the false binary of alcoholics and everybody else. Charles informs the viewer that the programme is not about people who drink sherry in the morning or wake up in shop doorways. This is about nice, regular drinking and the damage quietly being done to ourselves in society by drinkers like me. Throughout the documentary, Charles meets people who relay a range of lived experiences. Some have given up, some control their drinking, and some are still heavy drinkers. Of the latter, some appear open and somewhat reflective, while some understandably defensive given the stigmatised position of problem drinking. In turn, the programme shows how nuanced each person's drinking and possible motivations or barriers to change really are. Following the programme, in addition to the widespread media and social media coverage, a number of services reported significant increases in self-referrals, since described as the Adrian Charles effect. Downloads of an alcohol reduction app have also increased significantly, notably with a shift in user characteristics towards those with lower levels of problem drinking severity. As such, these diverse new narratives prompted people who would not have otherwise considered their alcohol use as in need of any scrutiny to enact a process of behavioural change. As one person talking about their lived experience of alcohol use becoming a bit of an issue during the COVID pandemic said on a podcast, which I'll admit is my own, I've got the quote here. So we need to talk a lot more about alcohol issues in society. And I'm really grateful for someone like Adrian Charles coming on. He's high profile and talking about his issues with alcohol. I related with it because I'm a big football fan as well. He added, I've changed my drinking behaviour. I don't drink wine now because that was very high alcohol content and it left me feeling tired in the morning. I've changed much more to just drinking less at the weekend and changing it to beer, which is obviously less strength and doesn't give me the same health implications. So in conclusion, as set out above, a diverse group of people experience some degree of harm or risk from their alcohol use, but the large majority reject problem drinking identities, in part due to the motivation to separate themselves from the highly stigmatised alcoholic other. This should not be regarded as a form of denial, although it is noteworthy that refusals to see one's problems with alcohol through the lens of either the dominant narratives can be interpreted as such. Rather, the current or dominant alcoholism or positive sobriety narratives may not resonate with many drinkers who do not see sobriety or recovery as a necessary response to their alcohol use, just as the unit guidelines are usually discounted by thus drinking above them. Thus, a broader, more flexible concept of alcohol use and problems and recovery is required to support problem recognition, help seeking, and make inroads into the persistently high stigma of alcohol use and problems. We therefore call for proactive efforts to support the range of a more diverse range of lived experiences that empower a wider but underrepresented group of drinkers, those for whom abstinence-focused goals may be perceived as threatening, impractical, or simply unnecessary. I think I'm just going to skip to the final paragraph, just because I'm aware of time. In the closing scene of Adrian Charles's documentary, Charles reflects on his experience of meeting drinkers like us and hearing their stories. He concludes, I don't do optimism, but I think I can change my life to drink less, and in doing so, maybe get more out of drinking and more out of the times that I'm not drinking. As such, Adrian Charles offers a lived experience that highlights an alternative model for thinking about and changing alcohol use. The Adrian Charles effect and the potential for other less spoken narratives to do the same is something that policymakers and lived experience advocates should not ignore. So I'll leave it there.
And I'm really pleased to introduce Sharon Greenwood, who's a lecturer in the College of Medicine, Veterinary and Life Sciences at the University of Glasgow. She teaches mostly for public health, where her teaching interests include substance use, ethical issues in health, and the politics of health. Her previous research experience ranges from looking at the impact of chronic illness on quality of life using Nussbaum's capabilities approach, to new psychoactive substance use in Scotland prior to the introduction of the 2016 Psychoactive Substances Act. Her PhD, which she will be talking about today, looked at the experiences of young adults who are or were affected by a parent's substance use. And I'll hand over to Sharon. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you see my slides okay? Are they all good? Perfect. Okay, so thanks for the lovely introduction, Kat. I'm going to take a slightly different focus, and it's quite good that I suppose that Emily and I had us having us bookended, where Emily's kind of talking about the research and positionality, and I'm kind of talking about the teaching element of positionality. And actually a lot of the things that Emily covered in her presentation are things that will come back up in mine. And actually thanks, because you did me a lot of groundwork by covering positionality so well in your presentation, so thank you, you saved me some time. So yeah, as Kat introduced me, I'm Sharon. I work at the University of Glasgow. I have been an undergrad, a postgrad researcher. I've had about every single job under the sun at the University of Glasgow, but now I'm finally in a permanent post, and the relief is palpable. You can sense it, so which is fantastic. So now I get to focus on some different things to do with pedagogy and some different things to do with teaching. So I'm in a teaching only post, which is why I'm really interested at the moment on positionality in teaching. But it's something that was really important to me during my PhD as well. Sorry if you see me totally look over to the side. I've got the chat and the Zoom screen over on this, but I've got my slides on this, so I'll be scooting between both. So I wanted to start off by kind of talking a little bit about knowledge production in higher education, and this bit builds on what Emily was talking about at the start, and this idea of what is good research. And what we are taught when we are baby sociologists, when we're learning, when we're introduced into the field. And you know, there's the kind of stereotype of the good research is evidence-based, it's investigative, it's conducted by rational actors, and they adhere to a hegemonic global conservative research agenda, and it's all about impact and fits in with funders' remits. However, real life isn't like that, and particularly for sociologists, we know that. So during my PhD, I really struggled with this, and I've always identified as a feminist, and actually having a lot of time in my PhD, being able to read into feminist epistemology and ontological work, and actually finding a home for myself there. And I think we're seeing a lot more of people who are identifying within that idea that actually good research is about acknowledging where we are. So Stanley and Wise talk about the unrealistic ideal of hygienic research. And I love that phrase and that idea that particularly because we see it so often with medical work, randomized controlled trials, that cleanliness, the hygienic, it's almost kind of Mary Douglas style purity and danger language that's used there. And Coffey talks about how we're always positively present in the research process, and that was something that was very important and very relevant to my experience. So for me, it's where is the space for personal experience, and I think we've kind of covered that really well over this morning, and it's been such a good event. So again, we've got in the academy, we've got this idea of research and teaching, and actually the synthesis between both is the research-led teaching, which is presumed as being the gold standard. It's one of the outputs that we desire from our good quality research. But what about positionality in this? And we've got positionality that we've kind of started to talk about in terms of research, but what about teaching? And where do we take a stance in teaching? So we talk a lot about reflective and reflexive research, but what about teaching? Can we take a stance in teaching, and can we expose our position in teaching? So going back to Becker's paper and Becker's really important paper, which I'm sure that a lot of you will have read at some point or another. The question is whether we should take sides, since we will inevitably will, but rather whose side are we on? So in terms about taking positionality, it's about acknowledging where we sit in the world. It's about acknowledging and presenting to other people where we are. So can we demonstrate vulnerability as educators? And that's something that I'm really focused on, and it's something that I'm kind of working on developing a research project about just now. And so thinking about pedagogy and the approaches to learning, pedagogy is about knowing and performing what you know. Reflexive pedagogy considers what one knows, how one performs it, and its implications for others. So we can all probably think about the times when we have been in a classroom where we have had a really positive experience, where we've had a really negative experience, and actually it all comes back to how that knowledge sharing process goes through. So talking a little bit here about shaping the educator. So this is a little bit of my personal history, and I guess you can't have a session on lived experience without sharing things about yourself, and it's something that's so integral to understanding who you are, understanding who I am, understanding my pedagogical approach. So as I said before, I've been at the University of Glasgow since 2007. 2004 to 2006, I was actually at the University of Strathclyde, and I did 2 years of a computer science degree, would you believe, which was awful. And I'm so glad that I left. And then I did my undergrads, and I did it in sociology, did a joint honours sociology and social policy. It took me 5 years to do, and I'll explain why in a wee minute. Then I went on to do my MRes, went on to do my PhD, and now I'm back doing an MEd, because that's what we do when we are when we're academics. So inhabiting this field, this area of education, I've also had jobs, and I've told you I had a lot of jobs. I was a GTA, a graduate teaching assistant, for so many years. I was a stand-in lecturer for a year. I have been an RA in so many different projects. Postdoc wise, I had a tutor post, and then I was lucky enough to get this post as a lecturer. However, what was missing from this? So this is my learning journey, this is my educational journey, this is my pedagogical journey. But obviously within this, you can't think about that without thinking about my background. So I have a background where I was massively affected by my mum's drinking and my dad's drinking. My mum passed away in 2009, which is why I've got that kind of small rupture in my undergrad. And I've put these kind of red ruptures as ruptures. They're disruptions to my pedagogical journey. It's ways in which that things have changed, things have shaped. Ways in which that my personal life, my experience of mental distress interacted with my pedagogical life, the ways in which I experienced care and kindness in the university, or the complete opposite, being completely excluded, being completely isolated. And going back to Anderson's quote about pedagogy is knowing and performing what you know. Yes, it's about knowledge. Yes, it's about teaching people about basic theories and encouraging them to be critical thinkers and learners. But we teach them how we've been taught. And reflective pedagogy considers the ways in which we know what we know and how we perform it and the implications for other people. So my journey through education was a very disrupted one. It looks very linear, doesn't look very disrupted at all. But in the process of since 2004 to 2019, I lost a parent. One of my parents had a massive stroke that was followed by 3 strokes. I was a main carer for both of them for a very long time. I moved house 3 times. I became a dog mum. All of those things shape how I am there, how I'm present, how I'm there for my students, how I'm not there for my students, and the ways in which I understand the world. And again, talking about Becker earlier, but I'm going back to Mills this time. When we think about the human meaning of public issues must be revealed by relating them to personal troubles and to the problems of individual life. So what I'm really interested in is how do we teach about things that are perhaps sore spots for us, things that are difficult to us, things that are that jar with us. And I think given that a lot of us here are working in the field of alcohol or drug work, we engage in this, we engage in these difficult spaces. So even if we haven't had personal bereavements or personal trauma linked to it. We all have personal experience, whether that is of consumption or non-consumption, the active decision to consume or to not consume, the active decision to judge another person for consuming or not consuming. It's so integral to how we understand the world. So how do we balance these personal troubles and public issues? So at all these kind of red ruptures were my personal troubles, you know, they don't matter to anyone else probably in this room, in this discussion. There were things that happened in my biography, but what they do, or what they have done, is shaped how I conduct myself as an educator, the things I value, the things I want to inhabit in my classroom. So building on this, can our stories contribute to knowledge? At what point can we actually, or do we actually, disclose in the classroom relevant personal stories? So do we tell stories of our personal encounters with substance use if we're teaching about substance use? And at what point does using personal stories as illustrations stop being useful and it enters the realm of the quote unquote self-indulgent navel-gazing narrative that is often levied against autoethnographic approaches? There's also the other bodies of work who argue that actually in essence it fetishizes trauma, and using these as almost tasters. Tamas talks about testimony, the accounts that are messy and embodied and effective, that are utilised to produce an emotional reaction rather than provide a clear knowledge. She argues that actually that leads to fetishising trauma. And she talks about how we've got these polished discourses, polished disclosures, according to Tamas, is how we turn trauma into knowledge. But that knowledge is about the emotional impact it has. So what does it mean? She says, my work needs to be unsanitary, compromised, because otherwise it compounds my injuries. I do not know how to write this way close to the bone. The cop in my head calls it melodramatic and embarrassing, but there are some stories I cannot tell any other way. On the other hand, we've got Goodson, who argues that actually experiencing trauma and talking about trauma to students is actually, it's our superpower. That's actually a superpower. And so Goodson argues that our wounds at whatever level, they affect who we are and how we interact with each other. And that transfers into the classrooms. It's important that we rise above our own struggles to provide an assistance to serve as an example to others quietly or not so quietly facing similar burdens. That, of course, sounds much simpler than the reality because it involves coming to terms with our own wounds. We most likely have or are in the process of dealing with our own limitations, our own feelings of being an outsider. We can recognise it in how some colleagues push to the front, sometimes quite literally trying to get the best seat at a meeting, while others quietly slip to the back. We're all still debating our value. So when we couple that with other factors that exclude or enhance privilege within higher education, gender, race, disability, ethnicity, we're seeing a massively compounding effect. And we know that trauma disproportionately affects people who are of minority status. So how do we stake a claim in HE and how do we use personal experience within our teaching lives? And you know, we've got the idea that emotional topics are often excluded from curricula, including substance use. I teach at a university where there is no substance use courses at all. There's one drugs and culture course, but there's nothing on alcohol. And for a Russell Group university, that's something that's quite telling about what priorities are, what agendas are. Is it about, and I'm just postulating this, I'm not saying this is the reason, but is it about that unhygienic knowledge? That's about this kind of dirty knowledge that we don't really want to be uncovering, that we don't want to be exploring, particularly in a place of privilege. We've also got elements of hidden traumas. And obviously we've got the ADFAM estimates of 1 in 10 people, which is around 5 million people in the UK, are currently affected by someone's substance use. So if you think about 1 in 10 in your class, if you're teaching an undergraduate classroom and that's got 250 students in it, you're talking over 20 students in that class could be dealing with someone who has is affecting their life. Bring it down to smaller groups, 2 people in a class of 20, still a significant number, but it's often excluded. And I have been that one person in the class who has been at the brunt of poor pedagogical decisions. And so I'll never forget the one situation where I was studying, it was a social policy course, and I put my hand up. We're talking about housing, put my hand up. The question was about, why do people have properties? And I put my hand up and I said, well, it's for security. It's for ensuring security for your future generations, for your children. And the lecturer in that time said to me, don't be stupid. When people die, they just sell the house and go on a nice holiday, and that's what happens when a parent dies. And unbeknown to that person, I had just come back after my mum had died, and had a secure place to live because my mum and dad had left the house. I had a place, a roof over my head. I had an ability to carry on with my studies, and that privilege that I was so happy that I had that security was being dismissed by, but again, that's wider issues about HE. So again, content needs to be shared with care, an unknown and unprepared audience. So using things like content warnings and sharing with people, being relatable. It's an awkward balance between this construction, and Wardle, who's an anthropologist, talks about the vulnerable student in need of care versus the neoliberal subject who's responsible for their own well-being. At what point do we owe a duty of care? I would argue we owe a duty of care throughout all of the educational experience. But again, it's so important. And going back to Anderson's paper, and I really recommend to have a read of Anderson's paper. They talk about disability in particular, but Anderson talks about how if a group's stories aren't told, they don't have a place in the learning community. And justice-minded learning communities also need to interact with people as these stories are told. And so Anderson actually goes on to talk about higher education as being third space. It's a pedagogical environment where you, an educator or student, or a student who is an educator or vice versa, can grapple with concepts that were not studied elsewhere. Where else are you going to have a discussion about what recovery means in a substance use context? So how do we do that? We've got critical pedagogical approaches. Webb et al., that's a great paper that talks about feminist approaches to pedagogy and how do we inform our teaching and to be in a kind of approachable and acceptable way. So again, considering power dynamics, thinking about setting ground rules, thinking about what is supportive, what isn't supportive, platform alternative perspectives, and invite speakers and share autoethnographic experiences. Provide space to talk and build connection, between student and educator, but also between students, allowing students this place to connect with each other and to perhaps relate to one another. If you create an environment where it's completely unacceptable to use stigmatizing language about substance use, then that person might actually feel like they can open up to a peer in that situation, and they can feel valued. To demonstrate care, provide content notes, and read the room. And a lot of that, it comes back to this, the concept of emotional intelligence, which we can debate until we're all blue in the face, but it's that idea of being able to read the people in the room, to understand what the vibe is in the room. Are people coping with the content? Are they not coping with the content? How can I make this easier for them? And challenge colleagues. How are we integral into this reification of harmful curricula? The only way that we're going to challenge stigma is through strong educational messaging, to educate people why these words are wrong, why we need to think about these different perspectives. And if we are integral into that system, and we are sitting in meetings and we are being complicit in meetings where they're saying you know, things that we don't actively challenge. We've got a position of privilege, a position of power where we need to stand up to that. And using our research, coming back to that, if our research has said something different, standing up for our participants. So, concluding remarks. Again, this has been a very kind of a paper that's been a lot of my own personal thoughts that have been bubbling about in my brain for a long time, but I'm hoping to pull it together into something that is actually makes sense, unlike my presentation. So any questions are very valued, but the key messages I wanted to leave you with. Personal narratives can be so helpful to connect with students, but it must be at the discretion of the educator, and you must be able to protect yourself and to think about the strengths in that. And there's a fantastic paper which I can pass on to the conveners. It was published this year. I haven't put it in the presentation, but talks about self-preservation as a form of care to the students. Educators should always be critically reflecting on their journey through higher education and recognising the places in which they were adequately supported or they were inadequately supported, and the aim is to do better. We need to do better. And we need to be an ally in learning and consider alternative experiences, particularly for those who come from less privileged backgrounds. And I would argue for people like myself who work at Russell Group institutions, this is even more important. We need to be standing up for those people who are disproportionately affected by substance use, domestic violence, childhood trauma. And that's me, I'm done.